The man her father owed money to stood at the altar in a black suit, watching her walk toward him through candlelight and the smell of gunpowder that hadn't happened yet, and Alara Voss thought, I am being sold, right? Her heels clicked against marble. 26 years old, wearing a dress she'd never chosen, in a room full of men who hadn't looked at her face once. They looked at her the way you look at collateral, something of value, something transferable. She kept walking. Her father had told her 3 days ago, hands shaking around a glass of bourbon he couldn't afford, Cassian Rourke will forgive everything. The house, the accounts, all of it. You just have to show up. He wouldn't meet her eyes when he said it. That told her everything the words didn't. Cassian Rourke. She'd heard the name the way you hear a weather warning abstract, distant until the storm is standing at your door. He controlled shipping routes along the entire eastern seaboard. He had judges on retainer and city council members who returned his calls before their wives. He had never been arrested. He had never been photographed at a crime scene. He had, according to her father's terrified accountant, personally bankrupted 3 men who tried to cheat him and watched 2 of them leave the country rather than face whatever came next. And now Alara was walking toward him in white. She reached the front of the room, stopped, made herself look at him. Cassian Rourke was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd built in her head, something monstrous, probably, something that matched the fear she'd seen on her father's face. But the man standing before her was 41 years old and looked like he hadn't slept properly in a decade. Dark circles, a jaw set so hard it might have been carved, eyes that were green and completely unreadable, the kind of eyes that had learned a long time ago not to give anything away. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Not hunger, not triumph, something closer to calculation, like she was a problem he was still working out. The officiant cleared his throat. Cassian didn't look away from her. Then he said quietly enough that only she could hear, You don't owe me a marriage. She blinked. You owe me the truth. Before she could process what that meant, before she could even form a question, the windows on the east wall exploded inward. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it. Now hit that notification bell, so you never miss what comes next. Stories like this one land on this channel every week. And once you're in, you're in. And do me one favor, drop a like on this video, then tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that burning room. The first shot came through the shattered glass and took out the chandelier directly above the altar. Crystal exploded downward. Women screamed. Men dove. The officiant dropped flat behind the podium as a second shot punched through the wall 3 feet to Alara's left, sending plaster dust into her face. She froze. She had never been in a room where someone was shooting. Her body had no protocol for this. Her mind went completely blank, in a way that felt almost peaceful, 1 full second of total white silence. And then Cassian's hand closed around her arm and yanked her sideways, and the peaceful silence ended. He moved fast. Faster than a man in a suit had any right to move. He pulled her down behind the altar structure, his body between hers and the windows, and she heard him bark 2 words at someone across the room, south corridor, and then there was answering fire from somewhere to her left, which meant his people had weapons already out, which meant this wasn't entirely a surprise to everyone in this room. Can you run? He said. His mouth was close to her ear. His voice was completely level. I don't. She was shaking. Her hands were shaking so badly she could feel her teeth. I don't understand what's happening. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. His face was 6 inches from hers. Whatever expression she'd seen when she walked toward the altar was gone. This was something else, entirely stripped down and operational. A man who had practiced staying alive under pressure until it became muscle memory. Yes, she said. I can run. Stay behind me. Don't stop moving no matter what you hear. Pulled her up and they moved. The south corridor was narrow and dark, lit by emergency lights that threw everything in red. Behind them, the gunfire in the wedding hall was intensifying. She heard shouting in at least 2 languages, heard glass breaking, heard something heavy fall. She didn't look back. Cassian was in front of her, and his hand was still locked around her wrist, and she focused on that, the physical fact of forward momentum. They made it 30 feet down the corridor before the man stepped out of a doorway. He was aiming directly at Alara. Not at Cassian. At her. She had just enough time to register that. Just enough time to understand that she was the target, not the collateral target, not collateral damage, and then Cassian stepped in front of her. The shot fired. Cassian's body lurched. He didn't fall. He hit the man with something fast and brutal that dropped the shooter to the floor. In under 2 seconds, then turned toward Alara, and she saw the dark bloom spreading through the white of his dress shirt, below his left shoulder. "You're shot," she said. "I'm aware." He grabbed her wrist again. "Keep moving. You need Alara." He said her name for the first time, and she didn't know why that stopped her arguing. "There will be time for this later. Right now we move." They moved. The safe room was behind a bookcase on the 3rd floor, a cliché that Alara might have found almost funny under any other circumstances. Cassian hit a panel, the bookcase swung, and they were inside a room the size of a generous closet. Reinforced steel door slamming shut behind them. Absolute silence, swallowing the chaos from below. She was still shaking. She was going to be shaking for a while, she thought. Cassian leaned against the far wall and let out a slow breath. His left hand pressed against his shoulder. Blood was soaking through the shirt at a rate she found alarming. "Take that off," she said. He looked at her, the jacket and the shirt. "You're bleeding through it. It's not, don't tell me it's not serious. I can see it's serious. Take it off." Something shifted in his face. Surprise, maybe. He wasn't used to people talking to him like that. She suspected people generally didn't. He shrugged the jacket off, winced in a way he clearly tried to hide, and began working the buttons of the shirt. His hands were steady, which bothered her somehow, that a man who'd just been shot could have steadier hands than she did from simply watching it happen. There was a first aid kit bolted to the wall. She found gauze, antiseptic, medical tape, the basics. She made herself focus on the wound, instead of everything else that was screaming for attention in her head. Bullet had gone through. Clean entry, exit. That was good, she knew that much. Pressed gauze against both sides. Applied pressure. Tried not to think about the fact that she was doing field medicine on a man 20 minutes ago at what was supposed to be their wedding. "The man in the corridor," she said. "He was aiming at me." "Yes." "Not at you." "Yes." "Why would someone want to?" She stopped. Pressed harder. He made no sound. "Why am I a target?" Cassian was quiet for a moment. It wasn't the quiet of someone deciding whether to lie. It was the quiet of someone deciding how much truth to offer and in what order. "Your father worked for someone before he worked independently," he said finally. "My father was an accountant. He was an accountant for a very specific kind of business. Before that business ended." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "What business?" "Victor Rourke's organization." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "Rourke," she said. "Same as you, same as me." He met her eyes. "Victor was my predecessor, my mentor for a time. He built the structure I inherited, and he built it on blackmail and extortion and about 30 years of very deliberate cruelty." A pause. "Your father knew where some of the bodies were buried. Figuratively. Mostly figuratively. My father never told me any of this." "No, he wouldn't have." Something crossed Cassian's face that she couldn't read. "He was trying to protect you." She taped the gauze in place. Her hands were still not entirely steady. "And the debt? The contracts? The reason I'm here tonight?" "The debt is real," he said. "The situation your father is in is real. But how it got that way," he stopped. "What?" "That's a longer conversation. I think," Alara said slowly, "that given someone just shot at me in a wedding dress, I've earned a longer conversation. That almost got something out of him. Not quite a smile. Something around the edges of one. Gone before she could be sure. When we're out of here, he said. Are we getting out of here? Yes. He said it with such complete certainty that she almost believed him. That bothered her, too, that his certainty was almost reassuring, when she had every reason in the world not to trust him. She looked at him sitting there, shirtless, blood-soaked, in a fortified closet on what was supposed to be his wedding night, and thought, what is actually happening here? They stayed in the safe room for 40 minutes. Alara sat on the floor with her back against the wall and tried to organize what she knew into something that made sense. Didn't cooperate. Every time she thought she had a shape for it, something else shifted and the shape collapsed. Cassian sat opposite her. He didn't talk. He didn't seem to feel the need to fill silence with reassurance, which was either refreshing or deeply unsettling depending on how she looked at it. At some point, she became aware that she was still wearing the wedding dress. She'd forgotten, somehow. She looked down at it, ivory, expensive, someone else's choice, and felt a wash of something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. "I didn't pick this dress," she said. Not to him, exactly. More to the air. "I know," he said. She looked up. "Did you pick it?" "No, who did?" "My assistant." She thought a pause. "She thought you'd want something that fit." Something about the phrasing struck her. She thought you'd want something that fit, not something that looked appropriate, not something that suited the occasion, something she'd want. "Your assistant sounds like she has better instincts than you do," Alara said. "Most people do," Cassian said, and this time the thing at the corners of his mouth was definitely there for a full second before it disappeared. She didn't know what to do with that. A knock came at the steel door, 3 short, 2 long. Cassian pushed himself to his feet, moving carefully but not slowly, and hit the release. The man who came in was built like a defensive end and had the kind of face that had been broken and reset at least twice. He looked at Alara with an expression of complete neutrality, then at Cassian. "Perimeter's clean," he said. 4 of them. 3 down. 1 is in custody. Who sent them?" The big man's jaw shifted. "He's not talking yet. He will." Cassian reached for his jacket, seemed to remember the state of his shirt, stopped. The big man held out a plain dark jacket without being asked, and Cassian put it on. "Get the car to the east exit. We're moving to the secondary location. And her? She comes with me." Alara stood up. "I'd like some input on that." Both men looked at her. "I understand I'm apparently in danger," she said. "I understand you seem to be the person in the best position to do something about that. But I am not going anywhere without knowing where I'm going." Cassian studied her for a moment. Then he said to his man, "Give us a minute." The big man withdrew. The door didn't quite close behind him. Cassian looked at Alara. "My estate. It's secure." He seemed to choose the next word with some care. "I have resources there that I don't have here. And I need to have a conversation with the man we took into custody, which will be easier there. And I'm just supposed to trust you." "You don't have to trust me," he said simply. "You can make your own assessment of the alternatives." That was not a reassuring answer. It was, however, an honest one. She wasn't sure which she'd prefer. She looked at him, this man she'd walked toward in candlelight an hour ago, who had said she didn't owe him a marriage, who had taken a bullet that was meant for her, and then kept moving and made herself think clearly. Someone had tried to kill her tonight. Not him. Someone else. Going back to her own apartment, to her father's house, to anywhere they already knew she might be, that was a worse alternative than the unknown. "Fine," she said, "but I'm not wearing this dress for another hour. Someone find me different clothes." The estate was 40 minutes outside the city, and for those 40 minutes, Alara sat in the back of an armored SUV and said nothing, and neither did Cassian, and the silence was somehow less awful than she would have expected. She watched the city give way to darkness and tried to understand the shape of the thing she'd been placed inside without her knowledge or consent. Her father had worked for Victor Rourke. She'd never known that. She'd been told her whole life that he was an independent accountant, that the clients were private for professional reasons, that she didn't need to know the details. She'd accepted that the way you accept the parts of your parents' lives that predate you as context without texture, real in the abstract, but not in any way that required her to do something about it. Now it had texture. Now it had bullets. The debt was real. Cassian had said that. He hadn't apologized for it or explained it away. It was real, and her father was in it, and she was here as the resolution. Except he'd also said, "You don't owe me a marriage. You owe me the truth." She turned that over. What truth? What did she have that he needed? She didn't know. She didn't know enough yet. And that was the worst part. She was moving through a situation she hadn't been briefed on, and every wall she tried to lean on turned out to be a door. The estate appeared through the trees, a large stone structure that had probably been a manor house in a previous century, lit from the outside with a particular quality of light that means security, not welcome. Counted cameras at the gate, counted the guards she could see, assumed there were more she couldn't. Inside it was quieter than she expected. Warmer. Someone had left lights on in a hallway that smelled like old wood, and something she couldn't identify, something with no obvious association, which meant her brain kept reaching for it and not finding a place to put it. A woman appeared 50s, efficient-looking, the kind of still face that had seen too much to register much. She took Alara's coat, gave her a look that was assessment and sympathy in roughly equal measure. "There are clothes in the East Room," she said. "Nothing glamorous. Should fit." "Thank you," Alara said. "I'm Marin." She said it like, "I'm the person who actually runs this house. The rest of it is theater. You need anything, you ask me." "Not the men." Noted. Cassian had already moved toward a different part of the house. She heard a door close somewhere down a corridor. She thought about the man in custody. She thought about questions that were about to be answered badly for somebody. Marin led her upstairs. The clothes were plain dark jeans, a gray pullover, flat shoes that were half a size too big. She changed in a bathroom that was larger than her apartment's living room and didn't let herself look in the mirror until she was done. When she finally did, she didn't recognize herself immediately, which was disorienting in a way that had less to do with the clothes than with everything that had happened. And since she'd left her apartment that evening in ivory silk and someone else's expectations, she sat on the edge of the bathtub. She needed to call her father. She didn't have her phone. It had been in a small bag she'd left in the wedding hall, and the wedding hall was now a crime scene. She had nothing. No phone, no ID, no money. Nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever was in this house. She realized, completely dependent on a man she didn't know, in a house she'd never seen, in a situation nobody had told her she was in until it was too late to make a different choice. The fear came back then, the real fear, not the adrenaline of bullets and broken glass, but the quieter, colder fear that sets in when the emergency is over and you have to reckon with what you're actually inside. She breathed through it, pressed her hands flat on her thighs and felt the physical weight of them and breathed. She was alive. That was something. Someone had tried to make her not alive, and she was still here anyway. She stood up. She found Cassian in a room that was clearly where he actually lived, as opposed to the formal parts of the house. Books stacked sideways because the shelves had run out of vertical space. A desk covered in paper that nobody had arranged. A glass of something amber, untouched. He was on a call, standing with his back to the door, and she heard enough to understand the call was not going well, for whoever was on the other end. She knocked on the open door anyway. He looked over his shoulder, held up one finger, finished the call in 4 words that she couldn't hear and turned around. He'd changed the ruined shirt. Someone had looked at his shoulder. She could see the edge of a proper bandage at his collar. He looked exhausted in the way that people who never admit to exhaustion look when the performance slips. "Your father is safe," he said before she could ask. "My people confirmed it an hour ago. He's at a location we know about. He's being watched." She felt the tension in her chest loosen by maybe 20%. "Does he know what happened tonight?" "He knows is enough." "That's not." "He knows you're safe," Cassian said. "That's what he needs to know right now." She crossed her arms. "You don't get to decide what my father needs to know." "No," he said. "You're right. I don't." He looked at her with that same unreadable expression from the altar, and she still couldn't name it. "The man we took into custody talked, and what he said changes some things. Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, not calculating this time something else. He was bracing for something. "The shooter was hired 6 weeks ago," he said. "Before your father's debt came to me. Before the arrangement was made. Before any of this." She didn't understand immediately. Then she did. "Someone set up the assassination before we were even engaged. Before the engagement was proposed, yes. Which means someone knew the engagement was going to happen. Before your father and I made the arrangement." His jaw was tight. "Which means either my organization was penetrated or the arrangement itself was engineered to put you here tonight." The room felt very still. "Engineered by whom?" she said. Cassian looked at her steadily. "That is the question I have been working on for 6 hours." And he reached for the untouched glass on his desk. Set it back down without drinking from it. Looked at the window instead. "I have a theory," he said. "But if I tell you what I think, you're going to ask me questions I don't have full answers to yet. And some of those answers, when they come, are going to be..." He stopped. "They're going to be difficult." She looked at him, this impossible man, bleeding through borrowed clothes in a house full of armed strangers who had taken a bullet meant for her, and then had the nerve to say she owed him truth rather than a marriage. "Let me tell you something about difficult," she said. 3 days ago, I found out my family is bankrupt. 2 days ago, my father sat in our kitchen and told me the only way out was to marry a man I'd never met. Tonight, someone shot at me in a wedding dress, I think." Her voice was steadier than she expected. "I think I have demonstrated a fairly functional relationship with difficult." Something broke open in his expression, very briefly. Then it closed again. "There's a locked room on this floor," he said, "at the end of the east corridor. I haven't opened it in 4 years. She waited. "Your father's name is in it." A pause. "Not because I put it there." She felt something cold move through her. "Who did?" Cassian finally picked up the glass, drank from it, set it down. "That," he said quietly, "is what I've been trying to understand since the day I inherited this empire and started finding things Victor left behind." Outside, somewhere on the grounds, a dog barked twice and went silent. Alara stood in the middle of a room that smelled like old paper and amber and secrets she hadn't been told, in a house she hadn't chosen, married to a man who might have saved her life tonight, or might be a more sophisticated kind of trap than the one she'd already identified, and she made a decision. She was going to find out which one it was, and she was not going to wait for him to decide when she was ready. "Tomorrow," she said. "You open that room and I'm in it." Cassian looked at her for a long moment. "Tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a promise exactly, but it landed like one. She slept badly. Of course she did. The room they'd given her was comfortable in the practical sense. Warm, clean, the mattress better than her own, but she lay in it and stared at the ceiling and ran the night through her head in pieces. The walk down the aisle. His face at the altar. "You don't owe me a marriage." Bullet. The corridor. The man aiming at her, not him. Why her? She was nobody. She was 26 years old and worked in insurance, the boring kind, not even the interesting corporate kind. She had a studio apartment and a cat she'd left with her neighbor, and a father she loved, despite everything he'd apparently kept from her whole life. Why would anyone go to the trouble of engineering a situation to put her in this house on this night specifically? What could she possibly have that someone needed badly enough to kill for? She fell asleep, somewhere around 3 in the morning without an answer. She didn't know that in a building 40 minutes away, in a room that smelled like cigarette smoke and old ambition, a man who was supposed to be dead was watching the lights of the city and saying her name out loud, like a chess move. And she didn't know that the answer to every question she was asking was sitting in her own memory, buried in childhood she'd been told was ordinary. Not yet. But she was going to find out. And, when she did, nothing, not the debt, not the marriage, not the careful architecture of secrets that had been built around her entire life was going to be what she thought it was. She woke up at 5:40 in the morning because someone was arguing in the corridor outside her door, not loudly. The walls were thick, and whoever was out there had the discipline to keep it below shouting. But it was argument unmistakably, and held the pressure until the light turned, the kind where both parties have completely stopped listening and are simply waiting for the other to pause long enough to respond. She lay still for a moment, listening to the cadence of it without being able to make out words, and then she got up. She pressed her ear to the door. 2 voices. Cassian, she recognized it already, that flat, controlled register, and a woman's voice she hadn't heard before. Younger than Marin. Sharper. She caught 3 words, already knows about, and then the voices moved away down the corridor, and she lost the rest. She dressed in the same borrowed clothes, opened the door. Corridor was empty. She stood there a moment, listening to the house. It was the particular silence of a building, with people in it who are all pretending to be asleep. She could feel it, the wakeful, watchful quality of it, the way sound moved differently when ears were trained on it. She went to find coffee. The kitchen was large and old-fashioned, and Marin was already in it, doing something efficient, with a French press that suggested she'd been up for hours. "You heard it," Marin said. Not a question. Alara sat at the kitchen table. Couldn't hear the words. Probably better. Marin set a cup in front of her. That was Renata, his cousin. She arrived an hour ago from the city. His cousin. She manages the legitimate side of things. The shipping company, the investment portfolio. Very capable woman. A pause that carried weight. Very angry woman this morning. About last night. About last night. About the situation. About Marin picked her next words, with the care of someone who has worked in a house like this long enough to know which information flows in which direction. About some things she found in the company accounts. Alara wrapped both hands around the cup. What kind of things? Marin looked at her steadily. The kind that don't add up. Before she could ask what that meant, footsteps in the hallway, and Cassian came into the kitchen, and behind him a woman who was 40-ish and beautiful, in the way of someone who had stopped caring whether people noticed and found that made them notice more. Dark hair, dark suit, an expression like a closed fist. This was Renata. She looked at Alara the way you look at a complication. So this is the wife, Renata said. This is Alara Voss. Cassian's voice was neutral enough to be its own kind of statement. Voss. Renata said it like she was testing the weight of it. Your father is Martin Voss. Yes. Martin Voss, who worked for Victor for 11 years. Alara set her cup down. I didn't know that until last night. Something moved across Renata's face, not disbelief. Exactly. More like the calculation of someone deciding how much disbelief to perform. That's a significant thing, not to know about your own father. Yes, Alara said evenly. It is, Renata. Cassian's voice carried exactly 1 degree of warning. Renata ignored it, the way you ignore a warning from someone you've been ignoring for 20 years. She pulled out a chair across from Alara and sat down and folded her hands on the table and looked at her directly. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to understand that it's not an accusation. It's information gathering. All right. Did your father ever give you anything to hold on to for him? Documents, files, a drive, anything he said to keep safe without explaining why. Alara looked at her. No. Any packages, letters, anything physical he asked you to store? No. Nothing like that. Renata held her gaze for a long moment. You're sure? I'm sure I would remember my father asking me to store unexplained documents. People don't always remember things they were given as children, Renata said. Things that seemed ordinary at the time. The word landed. Children. Something moved at the back of Alara's mind, not a memory exactly, more like the shape of one. And then it was gone before she could look directly at it. I'll think about it, she said. Renata sat back, looked at Cassian. Some conversation passed between them that had no words, and Alara watched it happen, and understood that these two people had been having this particular argument for years in various forms, and tonight it had taken a new shape. Cassian opened the locked room at 9 in the morning. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He just walked to the end of the east corridor with a key that had been in his jacket pocket, and not somewhere locked away. Somewhere he carried it, and Alara walked beside him, and he turned the lock and pushed the door open. The room was an office. Compact, organized with the precision of someone who had cared very much about the organization of it, which made its 4 years of disuse strange. Everything was in place. Nothing had been disturbed. It was like a room preserved inside a photograph. There was a desk, filing cabinets, a corkboard on the far wall with papers still pinned to it, edges curled slightly with age, and above the desk 1 framed photograph. A man Alara didn't recognize. 50s, heavy-set, with a smile that went all the way to his eyes, and suggested very strongly that you should not trust it. Victor, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Cassian stepped past her to the filing cabinet. This was his working office, when he used this estate. I haven't changed anything, I thought. He stopped. You thought you might need it. I thought I should understand what I'd inherited before I started altering it. He pulled open a drawer, flipped through files with the practiced motion of someone who had been through them before. 2 years ago, I found your father's name in here, in 3 separate files. She crossed to him. He laid the files on the desk without fanfare. She opened the first one. It was financial records. Dense, complex, the kind of thing that only made sense if you understood the architecture of the numbers. But her father was an accountant, and she'd grown up watching him read documents like these the way other people read. Novels, and some of that literacy had transferred. She could see the broad shape of it, money moving in circles designed to obscure its origin, amounts that varied just enough to avoid pattern recognition. Her father's initials appeared at the bottom of 4 pages. MV authorizing signature. He signed off on these, she said. Yes. What were they? Fund transfers, the kind of transfers that, if they were ever examined by the right authorities, would look like embezzlement. Cassian's voice was careful. Except the funds weren't going to your father. The accounts they were being moved into, none of them were his. She looked up. Someone used his signature. Someone used his authorization, which could have been voluntary or coerced. He paused. Victor was very good at both. She opened the second file. This one was different. Letters printed, not handwritten. The dates were 11 years back. She read the first paragraph of the top one and felt her stomach drop. The letter was from her father, to Victor Rourke, and it contained information about a federal investigation that was, at the time of writing, still in its early stages. Information that should have been confidential. He was informing on the federal case, she said slowly, or he was being coerced to inform, or both. Cassian sat on the edge of the desk. The distinction matters, but I don't have enough to determine which. What I know is that when the investigation eventually closed without charges against Victor, your father's financial situation deteriorated very quickly. Within 8 months, he had accumulated debt that, based on his legitimate income, made no mathematical sense. She set the letter down. Victor punished him, she said, for knowing. Victor punished everyone who knew things. That was how he operated. He built loyalty through debt, literal financial debt, but also informational debt. Everyone who worked for him carried something. Evidence of their own wrongdoing, or manufactured evidence he could deploy whenever he needed leverage. His expression was flat and precise, and she could see the particular disgust of someone who had spent years inside a structure, built by someone else's cruelty. Your father was not the first. He was not the last. She stood very still in the middle of the dead man's office. But Victor is dead, she said. Cassian looked at her. He said nothing. And in that silence and specific quality of it, the weight of what he was not saying, she felt the ground shift underneath her. He's dead, she said again. Less certain this time. That is what the record states, Cassian said carefully. But you don't believe it. He stood up from the desk, walked to the window. The grounds outside were lit gray with morning overcast. Discords visible at their positions along the tree line, the whole apparatus of a man who had learned to build walls because the alternative was exposure. Victor was declared dead 4 years ago, he said. Cardiac arrest. Private facility. I attended the service. He pressed his knuckles against the window frame. 3 months after the service, a man who had testified against Victor in a closed arbitration proceeding was found dead in his car in a parking garage in Philadelphia. The manner of death was specific, very specific, Victor's specific. She waited. 6 months later, a second man. Miami. Same specificity. He turned from the window. I have spent 4 years trying to confirm or disprove what I believe, and I have not been able to do either, which is either evidence that I'm wrong or evidence that whoever is helping him is very good. The room felt smaller than it had 5 minutes ago. If he's alive, she said. Last night starts to make a different kind of sense. Yes. She pressed 2 fingers to her forehead, tried to breathe steadily. Why am I the target? You said it yourself, I'm nobody. I'm an accountant's daughter who works in insurance. That's what I'm trying to understand. He crossed back toward the desk, stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in him, the particular hollowness around the eyes of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time. Renata's question this morning, about whether your father gave you anything. Did it? I don't know. I don't remember anything. The shape at the back of her mind again, the non-memory, the outline of something without content. There might be something. I don't know what. Cassian was watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize. It was the way he looked when he was thinking several moves ahead and didn't like any of them. I need to make some calls, he said. Marin will take you to. I'm not going anywhere with Marin. She said it quietly but completely. I'm staying. You can make your calls. But we are going to go through the rest of these files together, and you're not going to decide for me what I'm ready to see. He looked at her for a long moment. Renata thinks you're involved, he said, not as a victim, as a participant. I need you to understand that. I heard her voice this morning. She has reasons for what she thinks. They're not entirely unreasonable. I know. She looked back at him without flinching. Do you think I'm involved? He didn't answer immediately. She appreciated that a fast denial would have meant nothing. No, he said finally. Then Renata's opinion is her problem to solve. Can we get back to the files? They were still in the room 2 hours later when the call came. She knew it was significant. Before he said a word, his entire body changed when he looked at the screen. Something contracted, became very still in the way of something coiling. He stepped out of the room to take it. She stayed with the files, kept reading. She'd found her father's name 7 more times across the documents, always as a signatory, always on transactions whose real beneficiary was obscured, always in the period between 9 and 11 years ago. Picture building itself in the margins of all these pages was of a man who had been used as a tool, and then left holding the evidence of everything he'd been used for. The debt, the manufactured debt that had broken her family. She could see it now from the inside. It wasn't random. It wasn't even primarily about money. It was a silencing mechanism, a way to keep a man too desperate and too afraid to talk, holding the kind of debt that made lawyers look away and friends stop calling. Her father had carried this for over a decade. She thought about his hands around the bourbon glass. You just have to show up. He hadn't been selling her. He had been terrified and out of options and doing the only thing he could see. That didn't make it right, but it made it human. Cassian came back into the room, and his face was different. "What?" she said. "The man we took into custody last night." His voice was absolutely level. "He's dead." She stood up. Dead, Howrant cardiac arrest. He was in a locked room with 2 guards outside. A pause that contained a great deal. The medical examiner will need time to confirm. But the guard on the door said he'd been fine an hour before. No symptoms. Victor's specific, she heard him say again in her memory. "Someone got to him," she said. "Inside this house." Inside this house. Cassian said it like he was confirming a mathematical result rather than the fact that his security had been penetrated from within. But his jaw was tight. The tendons in his neck were visible, which means I have a problem in my own organization. He put the phone in his pocket, which is not new information, but the radius of it just got smaller. How many people knew you had him here? In custody, specifically. 8 people, plus whoever they told. She let that number sit. 8 people who knew. Any one of them could be the conduit passing information, opening a channel, making one phone call to someone who could move through the estate unseen, because they already knew every hallway and every camera position. "Renata?" she said. Something crossed his face. "She's family." It's not an answer. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." She watched him stand very still in the middle of his dead predecessor's office. A man who had inherited an empire built on betrayal and was discovering that the betrayal had survived the builder. He looked at the framed photograph above the desk. Victor's smile that reached his eyes and meant nothing. "I need you to do something," he said, "and I need you to do it without asking me why yet, because I don't have enough to explain." "What, tonight?" "I need you to call your father." She frowned. "You have my phone. I'll get you a line." He looked at her. "I need you to ask him one question. Just one. Ask him if he ever put anything in your childhood belongings that wasn't his. A document, a drive, anything he wouldn't have explained at the time." She stared at him. "You think he hid something?" "In something of mine. I think Victor thought he had everything your father knew. I think your father is smarter than Victor gave him credit for." A pause. "And I think if there's evidence powerful enough that someone is willing to kill over it on the night you arrived in this house, then the timing is not coincidental." The shape at the back of her mind. Again, the non-memory. It had more substance now, almost a texture. Something involving a box. Something involving her mother's name. A summer when she was 9 or 10 years old, and her father had pressed something into her hands and said, "Keep this safe. It's just family things. Don't worry about it." Cold. "My mother's things," she said. Cassian went absolutely still. "When she died, I was 11. My father packed up her things and gave me a box. Her jewelry, some photographs, old papers. She could hear her own pulse. I've moved it 4 times. It's in a storage unit I've had since college. I've never opened it." "Why not?" "Because it's my mother's things." Her voice was careful and even, and she was aware that it was doing a lot of work. "You don't just open that." Cassian was looking at her with an expression that was not quite urgency and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. "Your mother," he said. "What was her name?" "Clara." A pause. "Clara Voss." She was an archivist at a university library. She watched something happen in his face. She didn't know what it meant, but it was significant. She could feel it. The sudden sharp quality of his attention. The way the rest of the room seemed to go out of focus for him. An archivist, he said. Yes. Why does that? Because Victor had an archivist. On retainer. For years. Someone who managed his private records, not the financial ones, the operational ones. The evidence he kept on other people. The material he used for leverage. He was thinking as he spoke, not performing, genuinely working through something she could see assembling in front of her. She left the arrangement around 11 years ago. Victor told everyone she'd retired. He told me the same thing when I took over. His voice dropped slightly. I spent 8 months trying to find her and couldn't. Ilara stood very still. The summer she was 9, a box. Her father's hands pressing something into hers. Just family things. She was 35 weeks from her 12th birthday when her mother was diagnosed. Her mother left Victor's employment 11 years ago. Her mother had access to Victor's operational records. Her mother, who had worked in a library, who had known how to store and protect and archive information, who would have understood better than anyone how to hide something inside, something ordinary so it would survive. Your mother didn't retire, Ilara said. Not a question. Her own voice sounded strange to her. Distant. No, Cassian said. She ran. The room was very quiet. She ran, Ilara said. She hid what she'd taken. In something she knew would survive her. In something she knew would survive her. A box. Her daughter's name on the lid. Ordinary objects arranged around something extraordinary. Hidden inside the ordinary, the way her mother had probably hidden everything carefully, quietly, in the last place anyone would look. Ilara sat down in Victor Rourke's chair, in Victor Rourke's preserved office, and felt the ground reform entirely beneath her. She wasn't nobody. She'd been nobody on purpose. Her mother had made her into the most protected hiding place she could find, and then she had died, and the protection had held for 14 years because nobody knew to look. Until now. The storage unit, she said. Her hands were completely still on the desk. Someone else knows about it. If they didn't before last night, Cassian said, they know now that you're alive and we're talking. She looked at him. How long before they move on it? If they're as organized as I think they are. He checked his phone. Hours, not days. She stood up from the chair. Then we need to get there first, she said. He was already reaching for his phone. And somewhere, across the city, in a building that smelled like cigarettes, smoke, and patience, the man who was supposed to be dead picked up the call on the first ring and said, "Find the unit. Tonight, whatever is in it, burn it." The past that Clara Voss had hidden was about to become a fire, and Ilara was standing directly in front of it. The storage facility was 40 minutes from the estate on a good night. Cassian made it 26. Ilara sat in the passenger seat of the armored SUV and watched the city blur past the window and didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. Her hands were in her lap. She was pressing her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger, not hard enough to hurt, just hard enough to feel a grounding habit she'd had since she was a child, something her mother used to notice and gently redirect. You don't have to hold on that hard, sweetheart. Nothing is going anywhere. Her mother had been wrong about that. Cassian drove. He didn't speak either. Behind them, another vehicle, 2 of his men, the one she was learning to recognize by posture rather than name. The big one, who'd met them in the safe room, was in the back seat. She'd learned his name was Doyle. He looked out the window with the flat, patient alertness of someone who had done this particular kind of night drive many times. The unit number, Cassian said. 47, East Wing. She'd had the access code memorized for 7 years without ever using it. The mind kept things you thought you'd let go. My name is on the account. They'll have it then. I know. He drove faster. The facility was one of those anonymous structures on the edge of an industrial district, the kind of place designed to be forgettable. Rows of orange doors under fluorescent lighting, a gate that required a code, security cameras at intervals that were adequate but not impressive. The gate was already open. Cassian stopped the SUV 50 feet from the entrance. Cut the lights. In the back seat, Doyle made a sound that wasn't quite a word, some abbreviated alert, that clearly meant something to Cassian because he put the vehicle in park without being asked. How many? Cassian said quietly. 2 vehicles inside, Doyle said. Plate on the near one is a rental. Other one's local. Count? Can't from here. At least 3, maybe 5. Alara looked at the open gate, the fluorescent light spilling out into the parking area. The absolute stillness of it, the quality of a place that has already been entered and is currently occupied. They're already in there, she said. Yes. Cassian's voice was completely steady, which means we have 2 options. We pull back, we call for backup, we wait. Or we go in now and we accept that the odds are worse. She understood the structure of that without needing it spelled out. If they waited, whatever her mother had hidden might not exist anymore by the time they reached it. 47 years of cold storage and 4 cars in a parking lot, and a man who was supposed to be dead who had given an instruction to burn it. How long for backup, she said. 20 minutes. Maybe 15 if. They'll be done in 15. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was not comfort and not strategy, but a mutual recognition of an unpleasant fact. Stay in the vehicle, he said. Non-negotiable. She wanted to argue. She didn't. He was right, and she was smart enough to know it. Cassian and Doyle moved with a speed and coordination that was clearly not improvised. They'd done this before. Together, and the choreography of it was so practiced it had become unconscious. They were through the gate in under 30 seconds, moving along the interior wall, out of the camera angles she could identify. She sat in the dark vehicle. 30 seconds passed. 45. She heard nothing from inside the facility. That was either very good or very bad, and she had no way to know which. She pulled the door handle and stepped out. She stayed close to the wall and moved slowly, and told herself she was not being stupid. She told herself this multiple times. The argument was not particularly convincing, but she kept making it. The east wing was a long corridor of orange doors, harsh light, the smell of concrete and climate-controlled air. She counted the unit numbers as she moved. 29, 31, 33 odd numbers on this side. The sequence, pulling her forward, her heart doing something irregular and insistent against her sternum. She heard voices from ahead. 2 men, not arguing, talking with the brisk efficiency of people doing a job they've been given specific instructions for. She heard something metallic, the sound of a lock being worked, and then the distinctive grind of a rolling door being pulled upward. Unit 47. She pressed herself against the door of Unit 43 and held her breath. Nothing's labeled, one voice said. Annoyed. Then we take everything. The second voice was older, flat. In charge. He said, burn it. We can't burn it here. We box it and we move. All of it. She was close enough now to see the edge of the open door. Box being carried out. Then another. Brown cardboard. The kind of anonymous packaging that tells you nothing. Her mother's handwriting might have been on some of them. She would never know. She looked at the 2 men from the angle she had. Both had their backs to her. A third was inside the unit, passing boxes out. She needed to do something. She had no plan, no weapon, no backup within earshot. She had 26 years of a life that had just been completely reframed around a secret her dead mother had trusted her to protect without knowing she was protecting it. She picked up the fire extinguisher mounted to the wall beside her. It was heavier than she expected. The bracket made a sound when she pulled it free, not loud. But in the stillness of the corridor, it was enough. The man nearest to her started to turn. And then Cassian came around the corner, from the other end of the corridor at speed. And the next 45 seconds were chaos that she experienced, mostly as sound and movement, and the particular physical shock of pressing herself against a wall, while people moved very fast in a space that didn't have room for it. When it was over, 2 men were on the floor. The third, the older one who had been giving instructions, was against the wall, with Doyle's forearm across his throat. And Cassian was standing in the middle of the corridor, breathing hard, looking at Alara with an expression she had never seen on his face before. I told you to stay in the vehicle, he said. I know. Alara, I know. She set the fire extinguisher down. Her hands were shaking again. She was beginning to think they might never stop. Boxes. They were taking them, all of them. He looked at the boxes stacked beside the open unit, then at her. He made a decision visible on his face, not about strategy, about her, about something. And then he moved to the open unit and looked inside. Followed him. It was smaller than she remembered. Of course it was. She'd last been here at 19. And memory scaled things to the size of the emotional weight they carried. But it was organized with a neatness that was entirely her father's, labeled in his precise hand, stacked in chronological order. The kind of system you build when you need to know you can find things even when nothing else is in your control. And against the far wall, separate from the rest, a single box, not labeled in her father's hand. Her mother's writing. Family things. Alara stood in the doorway of the unit and looked at that box and felt something she couldn't name move through her from the feet up. Cassian stood beside her. He didn't reach for it. He waited. She crossed the unit and picked it up. It was lighter than 14 years of weight should be. She set it on the nearest flat surface, a larger box behind her, and opened the flaps. Her mother's jewelry, a photograph of the three of them, her parents young in a way she'd forgotten they'd ever been, squinting into sun, somewhere that looked like a lake. A child's drawing hers probably, from the quality of it, of something that might have been a house or might have been a boat. And at the bottom, beneath a folded piece of cloth, a hard drive. Small, the older kind, the kind you plugged into a laptop with a cable you'd need to find. And taped to it, a piece of paper folded twice. And on the paper, in her mother's handwriting, "For whoever comes after me, you'll know what to do with this." She held it, didn't move. She knew, Alara said. Her voice came out very quiet. She knew she wasn't going to make it. Cassian said nothing. He was looking at the drive with an expression she now recognized as the specific strength of a man who understood that this was not his moment and had enough humanity left to stand aside for it. She hid this for 14 years, Alara said. Inside my things. Inside, she stopped. She used me. She protected you, Cassian said carefully. Both. She closed her hand around the drive. She did both. They were back in the SUV within 10 minutes. The boxes from Unit 47 loaded, Doyle managing the man they'd taken into custody with quiet efficiency. Cassian drove again. Faster. Alara held the drive in both hands and stared at the road ahead. She was thinking about her mother, about the particular kind of courage it took to look at your own dying and still make a plan, to hold knowledge that powerful and decide how to protect it rather than destroy it, because maybe destroying it wouldn't be enough. Maybe someone would need it someday. Maybe the only real protection was documentation that survived you. An archivist to the end. We need to read it, she said. I know someone who can open it safely. If it's encrypted, my mother would have encrypted it. Yes. A pause. There's someone I trust at the university. She works in digital forensics. Can have her. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face did something Alara had not yet seen it do. What? She said. He answered the call. Put it on speaker. Said nothing, just listened. The voice on the other end was male, older, with a quality she couldn't immediately define. It wasn't threatening. It was something more unsettling than threatening. It was certain. It had the cadence of someone who has not been afraid of consequences for a very long time. Cassian, the voice said, you have something of mine. Victor. Cassian's voice was absolutely flat. The name hit the interior of the car like a physical thing. Alara went very still. I see you've been efficient tonight, Victor said. You have the drive, and I suspect you have the girl who was carrying it without knowing. Both valuable. Congratulations, you're dead, Cassian said. The record is clear. Records are things people write down. I was very good at finding people who wrote things down. A pause. Something that might have been amusement. Your father taught me that, actually. Before I taught you. Alara watched Cassian's knuckles go white on the steering wheel. What do you want? Cassian said. What I have always wanted. What was taken from me. Victor's voice was patient in the way of someone reading from a list. That drive contains 11 years of operational records that your wife's mother stole from my archive. The financial evidence alone is worth more than you can imagine to the people who would act on it. Structural evidence, the political relationships, the coerced arrangements, that is worth considerably more. Another pause. It is also dangerous to anyone whose name appears in it, which is a long list, including yours, especially mine, which is why I need it back. Cassian said nothing. I'll make this simple, Victor said. The drive. Your wife. In exchange, Martin Voss is returned alive, and your organization survives the next 48 hours without incident. Alara felt her blood drop 10 degrees. My father. she said. Not to Victor. To Cassian. He said my father. Cassian looked at her. 2 seconds. Then Martin Voss is at a location I verified. Was at a location, Victor said pleasantly. He is currently my guest. He has been, I should say, for the past 3 hours. He asked me to tell you, he said you'd know this phrase, that the books don't balance. He was very insistent about that. I thought it was a strange thing to say. The books don't balance. Her father's accounting language. His private signal, the thing he said, when something was fundamentally wrong, in a way that numbers could reveal. He'd used it once when she was 15 to describe a landlord who was cheating tenants. He'd said it like a verdict. He was telling her the evidence on the drive was real. He was telling her through Victor that he knew she'd found it. He was also telling her something else. He was telling her he was alive enough to send a message. She held on to that. I need time, Cassian said. You have 8 hours, Victor said. After that, my patience, which has always been my greatest asset, expires. A pause. Cassian. Do not make me demonstrate what I'm capable of. You of all people know what demonstration costs. The call ended. The SUV moved through the dark city and nobody spoke. The estate was different when they returned to it at 2 in the morning. The same guards, the same lights, the same stone and iron of a house built for exactly this surviving bad nights. But it felt compromised in a way it hadn't before, because now she knew the prisoner was dead. Now she knew there was a leak. Now she knew that somewhere inside this structure was a person who had made a phone call, or opened a door, or done something small and catastrophic. Renata was awake. Of course she was. Renata looked like the kind of woman who slept 4 hours on principle and considered the other 20 her professional time. She was in the main room with 2 laptops, open and a phone in her hand, and she looked at them when they came through the door, and her expression said, I already know. Called you too, Cassian said. 40 minutes ago. Renata set the phone down. He said, and I want you to note the specific phrasing. He said hello to his favorite niece. The room went quiet. Alara looked at Renata, at the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the particular blankness of someone managing something very large. Victor is your uncle, Alara said. Was technically, given that he's supposed to be dead. Renata's voice was dry enough to catch fire. My mother was his sister. He raised me for 3 years after she died. She stopped. Something moved through her face that was controlled, so quickly you could only see its shadow. He was not a good man, but he was family, and I understood what that meant in the context of our family. And when he died, she stopped again. Different reason this time. I thought it was over. Did you know he was alive? Cassian said. The question sat in the room with all its weight. Renata looked at him. 14 years in his organization. His cousin by blood and by choice. The person who had run the legitimate side of everything he'd built. No, she said, I did not know. Her voice was steady and completely furious. And if you ask me that question in that tone again, Cassian, I will walk out of this house, and you can handle the next 48 hours without me. Something calibrated in Cassian's expression. All right, I'm telling you now. He called me to make me question you. That's what he does. That's what he has always done. She looked at both of them. He told me the drive your wife is holding is going to destroy this family. What's on it? She paused. He said it goes further back than Victor. He said our grandfather built the original structure, that the evidence on that drive will indict people in this family who are not Victor. Alara set the drive on the table. Everyone in the room looked at it. It was the size of a paperback. Smaller, maybe. The kind of object that should be unremarkable. Sat on the table in the middle of the night in a house full of armed people, and it had more weight than anything else in the room. We need to read it, Alara said, before we make any decision. We read it first. If we read it, we can't unread it, Renata said. Quiet. Not a warning, just accurate. We already can't unread tonight, Alara said. My father is missing. Someone tried to kill me at my own wedding. Someone killed the man who could have told us who sent the shooters. She looked at Renata, then at Cassian. The moment for choosing comfortable ignorance passed a while ago. The laptop was Renata's. The encryption on the drive was layered and serious, which confirmed that her mother had known exactly what she was doing and confirmed also that her mother had understood she might not be the one who ultimately opened it. She'd left a key, not a digital one, a paper one, folded into the bottom of the box. written in a code that took Alara 20 minutes to recognize, and another 10 to work through, because it wasn't a code at all. It was library catalog notation. Her mother's professional language, kind of thing that would look like random letters and numbers to anyone who didn't know how a card catalog was structured. To an archivist's daughter who had grown up watching her mother work, it was a password. Alara read it into the laptop. The drive opened. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes of scrolling, of opening files, of reading the first paragraphs of documents that had been sitting in a storage unit in anonymous darkness for 14 years, waiting for someone to open them. It was Renata who spoke first. Her voice was very controlled. "This isn't Victor's empire," she said. Cassian said nothing. He was reading. "This predates Victor by 20 years. Renata scrolled to a file dated 41 years back. Then another. Then another. This is the original structure. This is," she stopped. Alara was reading a different file. A list of names. Politicians, judges, 2 federal investigators, a harbor commissioner, 3 city council members across 2 administrations, a deputy director of something she'd need to look up. Beside each name, dates, amounts, specific incidents, documented leverage. The kind of file you built when you wanted to make absolutely sure that everyone who might oppose you had more to lose by opposing you than by staying still. And at the top of the list, in a column marked Origin, one name appeared beside every single entry. Not Victor Rourke, not Cassian. The name was Gerald Mercer. She didn't recognize it. She looked up. Cassian had gone completely still across the table. Kind of still that meant the information had hit something structural. "Who is Gerald Mercer?" she said. Renata and Cassian looked at each other. Cassian said finally. "He died 15 years ago." Something in his voice had changed, stripped down to something almost bare. "He was my mother's father, my grandfather." She waited. "He was a federal judge for 22 years, Cassian said. "Decorated, retired with honors." He looked at the screen, at the list, at the dates. "He built this." "Before Victor," Renata said quietly. "He built it before Victor. Victor inherited it. Like you inherited it from Victor," Alara said. The silence that followed had a different quality. Not emptiness, the full, pressurized silence of a room where something has just become true that cannot become untrue. Cassian had spent 4 years dismantling what he thought was Victor's legacy. He had cut connections, burned structures, turned legitimate, operated with a specific understanding of what he was working against and what he was cleaning up. But if the structure was older than Victor, if it had been built by someone Cassian had been told was an honorable man, a man he'd been raised to respect, foundation he'd thought was separate from the corruption, then everything he'd dismantled was the visible part. The roots were somewhere else entirely. The roots might be in places he'd never thought to look. And the names on this list, judges, investigators, council members, some of them would be dead. Some of them would be retired, and some of them, she was looking at the dates and doing the math. Some of them were still active, still in place, still operating inside structures that her grandfather had built around them, like concrete around rebar. Victor doesn't want this, because it exposes him, Cassian said. He was speaking slowly, thinking as he went. He wants it because it exposes the people who are still protecting him, people who have been making it possible for a dead man to operate for 4 years without anyone finding him. He looked at the list. Half these names are still in public positions, he said. More than half, Renata said. I count at least 11 active. 11 people currently holding power who would do anything to make sure this drive disappeared. Victor didn't just have Cassian's father as leverage. He had judges. He had investigators. He had people inside the machinery of consequence. He had been safe for 4 years because the machine that should have found him was built by the same hands that built his empire. And now Alara was holding the only evidence that could change that. Her father was missing. The prisoner was dead. The man in the shadows had an 8-hour clock running. And the woman who had walked toward a stranger in candlelight 2 days ago, thinking she understood the spread, the shape of the trap she was inside, realized that she had been wrong about the size of it. Trap wasn't a marriage. The trap was an entire architecture of power, built over 40 years, designed to survive every person who tried to dismantle it, and she was sitting in the middle of it with a hard drive in her hand in 8 hours to figure out how to use it before the man who built it took it back. Cassian looked at her across the table. His face was open in a way she hadn't seen before, not vulnerable. Exactly, but honest. The performance of control had slipped, just enough, and underneath it was a man who had spent 4 years believing he knew what he was fighting, and had just discovered the actual dimensions of it. "I need to know," he said. "What do you want to do?" Not, "I have a plan." Not, "This is how we handle it." He was asking her. She was looking at the drive, at the list, at the weight of what her mother had spent her dying, months preserving, and he was asking her what she wanted to do with it. She looked at the clock on the wall. 2:14 in the morning. 6 hours and 46 minutes left on Victor's patience. Somewhere, in the city, her father was in a room she didn't know, saying things through borrowed language, staying alive by being useful. She looked at Cassian. "We're not giving him the drive," she said. "No. And we're not trading me." "Absolutely not." "Then we have less than 7 hours to build something that makes it impossible for him to win, no matter what he does to either of us." She pressed both hands flat on the table, which means we stop playing defense. She looked at Renata, then back at him. "Where do we start?" Cassian reached for his phone, and in a building across the city, Victor Rourke looked at the clock on his wall and felt, for the first time in 4 years, something he hadn't planned for. Felt the situation beginning to move in a direction that wasn't his. Cassian made 4 calls in the first 20 minutes. Alara watched him work from across the table and understood, for the first time, what it actually looked like when a man dismantled his own life in real time. Not dramatically, not with speeches, just methodically, calling people he trusted, telling them specific things in specific order, moving assets and information the way a surgeon moves instruments. No wasted motion, no visible emotion. But his shoulder was still bandaged under his shirt, and she could see from the way he held the phone that it hurt more than he was acknowledging. Renata was on her own phone in the corner, speaking quietly in a voice that had dropped all its earlier sharpness and become something purely functional. She was calling someone in federal territory. Alara caught enough to understand. It was a contact, not an agency. Someone Renata had cultivated privately and separately from everything connected to the family name. That was interesting. That Renata had a separate line. Alara sat with the drive in her hand and thought about her mother. Clara Voss had been 38 when she was diagnosed. She had spent the last 14 months of her life doing exactly what she'd spent her career, doing: organizing information, protecting it, making sure it would be findable by the right person at the right time. She had done it while raising a daughter and dying and never saying a word about any of it because the word would have been a target painted on everyone she loved. The archivist's last project. Alara pressed her thumb against the edge of the drive until she felt the corner of it. Sharp. Real. "I'm sorry, Mom," she thought. "I should have opened the box." Then she stopped that. It wasn't useful. "The federal contact," she said to Renata when the call ended. "How clean are they?" Renata looked at her. "Clean enough that Victor doesn't have their name." "You're sure?" "I've spent 12 years making sure." She set the phone down. "She's a deputy U.S. attorney. Organized crime division. She has been trying to build a case on this network for 6 years and hitting walls at every turn." Renata's voice was very controlled. "Walls that I now understand were built by the names on that list. Will she move on it?" "She'll move on it the second I send her the first 3 files." Renata looked at the drive. What's on that drive is enough to open investigations that these men cannot close, because the people they would normally call to close it are in the files too. Cassian put his phone down and crossed to the table. Doyle confirmed 2 vehicles circling the perimeter. "They've been there for 40 minutes. Victor's people," Alara said, watching, not moving yet. He looked at the clock. 4:17 in the morning. He's waiting for the 8 hours to run out, which is, she calculated, 10:30 this morning. Yes, he sat down. His jaw was tight, and his eyes had the particular quality of someone who has stopped sleeping, because sleep is no longer a resource he can access. But if we send the files to Renata's contact tonight, before the deadline, then when he comes for the exchange, he's walking into a situation where the evidence is already in federal hands. He'll know immediately, Renata said. His people inside the system will flag it. How fast? Hours. Maybe less. Then we need the federal response to be faster than his ability to suppress it. Cassian looked at Renata. Can she move that quickly? If I give her enough to act on, yes. She has a standing RICO structure that she can activate. She's been waiting for primary evidence for 2 years. Renata paused. She can have warrants within 3 hours of receiving the files. 3 hours, Alara said. If we send it now, warrants by 7:30. Victor's deadline isn't until 10:30, which gives us a 3-hour window, Cassian said, in which Victor does not yet know the drive is in federal hands. But the process is already irreversible. Alara looked at both of them, and my father. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. We get him out first, Cassian said. Before we send anything. You don't know where he is? I have a theory. He pulled out his phone and opened a map. Victor used 3 locations when he was operational. I know 2 of them. The third a property outside the city, off the books, held through a shell company I identified 8 months ago, but couldn't confirm it was active. He pointed to a location on the map, an industrial property, 40 minutes north. If Victor has been operating from somewhere in the last 4 years, it's that building. That's a theory, Renata said. Yes, going in on a theory. I know. He looked at her steadily. Do you have a better one? Renata looked at the clock, looked at the map, pressed 2 fingers to her forehead in a gesture that was the first crack in her composure Alara had seen. No, she said. Cassian looked at Alara. I need you to do something that I cannot make you do. What? Stay here. Send the files with Renata. Be the person who ensures the evidence gets to where it needs to go no matter what happens to me. She looked at him for a long moment. What happens if you find him? And Victor has already. She stopped herself from finishing the sentence. Your father is leverage, Cassian said. Victor will not destroy his leverage before the deadline. That is not how he operates. He paused. That is how I know he's still alive. She wanted to argue with that. She wanted to say that Victor was unpredictable, that 4 years of supposed death had given him time to become something different, that the rules of how he operated might have changed. But she also knew, looking at Cassian's face, at the absolute certainty in it, that this was not blind confidence. This was the assessment of a man who had studied Victor Rourke for 20 years. Come back, she said. Not a request. That's the plan. Cassian, she held his eyes. You come back. Something in his face moved. Settled. Yes, he said. He left at 4:45 with Doyle, and 2 others she'd learned to recognize. Renata began transmitting files at 5:10, sending them in encrypted batches to a secure federal address that she'd memorized rather than stored. Alara sat beside her and watched the progress bar and thought about her father in a building 40 minutes north and her mother's handwriting on the bottom of a box and the particular cruelty of a world that asked people to be brave without warning them first. The house was very quiet. At 5:40, Renata's contact called back. Alara could hear only one side of the conversation, but she watched Renata's face and read it the way you read weather. A tightening here, a slight release there. When Renata ended the call, her expression was something Alara hadn't seen on her before. She's moving, Renata said. Emergency session with a federal judge. She says the financial evidence alone is enough for 4 warrants. A pause. She also said, and this is verbatim, that she's been waiting 2 years to make this call, and whoever provided the evidence should know that. Alara looked at the drive on the table. My mother provided the evidence, she said. 14 years ago. Renata looked at her. For the first time since Alara had met her, the calculation in her face softened into something that was simply human. Then she won, Renata said. It just took a while to land. Call from Cassian came at 6:20. 2 words, we have him. Then the line went quiet for 4 seconds. That were the longest 4 seconds of Alara's recent life. And then she heard her father's voice thinner than she remembered. Rougher, but his. Alara, Dad. Her throat closed. She pressed through it. Are you hurt? Bruised. Nothing serious. They didn't. A breath. The books don't balance, sweetheart. You found it. I found it. Your mother. He stopped. She could hear him getting control of something. Your mother was the bravest person I have ever known. I know, she said. I know that. They came back at 7:15 and her father walked through the door with Cassian's hand on his shoulder and Doyle behind him, and he looked smaller than he had 3 days ago when he'd sat in his kitchen and asked her to do the impossible. Smaller and older, and held together by something that was pure stubbornness. She crossed the room and put her arms around him, and he held on with the grip of someone who has spent 6 hours deciding what he would say when he got the chance. "I'm sorry," he said, into her hair. "I'm sorry for all of it, for not telling you." "Stop." She pulled back enough to look at him. "We'll have that conversation, just not right now." He looked at her face. At whatever was on it, the exhaustion, probably, and the residue of a night that had restructured everything she knew about her own history. "You look like her," he said. "Right now, you look exactly like her." She didn't trust herself to answer that. By 8 in the morning, the first warrants had been issued. Renata's contact moved with a speed that suggested she had, in fact, been waiting for exactly this for 2 years, and had kept everything in a state of readiness against the possibility. 3 of the names on the list were served before 9. A fourth, a sitting judge, who, according to the files, had been embedded in the structure for 18 years, attempted to contact someone to suppress the process and found that the contact had already been detained. The machine was eating itself. Victor's machine. Gerald Mercer's original machine, inherited by Victor, maintained through a network of maintained people who had each believed they were too protected to be reached. The drive was the reach. Alara sat in the main room of the with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, and listened to Renata receive updates every 15 minutes, and felt the structure of the situation changing around her like pressure in the air before a storm breaks. Cassian sat across from her. He hadn't slept. His shoulder was visibly hurting. She could see it in the way he held himself, the slight forward lean, the economy of motion that meant he was managing pain. He hadn't mentioned it once. "Victor will know by now," she said. "He'll know soon." His contact at the federal level was detained at 8:40. He looked at his phone. When that happens, his other contacts will go dark immediately. Standard protocol. They protect themselves first, which leaves him isolated. For the first time in 40 years, his voice was flat, but she could hear something underneath it. Not satisfaction, something more complicated. The particular feeling of dismantling something you helped maintain without knowing its full dimensions. "What will he do?" she said. Cassian looked at her steadily. "He'll come here." The room went quiet. "He has nowhere else to go," Cassian said. "His network is being rolled up. His leverage is in federal hands. His properties will be identified and secured within hours." He set his phone down. "He has one remaining option. Come here and try to take the drive back by force before the chain of custody is fully established." "The drive is already in federal hands," Renata said from across the room. "He doesn't know that yet. Then we need him to—" The perimeter alarm went off. Not subtle, a physical sound, deep and resonant, that moved through the floor of the house and registered in the body before it registered in the mind. Alara was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. Cassian was already moving, phone to his ear, 3 words to someone on the other end. Doyle appeared at the doorway. 6 vehicles. North Gate. "They're not slowing down." "How many?" Cassian said. "At least 12. Maybe 15. Victor. Not waiting for 10:30. Not waiting for his deadline. Moving now, fast, because something in the network had tripped an alarm, and he understood maybe not the full scope of it. Not yet, but enough that time was no longer on his side. Cassian turned to Alara. His face was stripped completely clean of anything that wasn't necessary. "The East Wing," he said. "The safe room. You and your father. Now." "Cassian, Alara, I need to know you're contained. I cannot do what I need to do if I'm calculating your position." He closed the space between them in 2 steps, and his hand was on her jaw, not forceful. "Just present something grounding and immediate. I need you safe so I can move." She looked at him, at the exhaustion and the certainty and the wound he'd been ignoring since the night they'd met. "Don't be stupid about the shoulder," she said. "I'll be very intelligent about the shoulder. Go." She went. The safe room was exactly as she remembered from the first night. Steel door, emergency lighting, the compressed silence of a fortified space. Her father sat against the far wall, and she sat beside him, and they listened to the house. They heard the distant percussion of the north gate giving way, heard shouting, heard the specific crack of weapons, heard at one point something that shook the east wall hard enough to send dust from the ceiling in a fine curtain. Her father's hand found hers in the dark. She held it. She thought about the drive, already transmitted, already in federal hands, already irreversible. She thought about Renata, who had evacuated through the south exit 10 minutes before the gate went down, carrying the physical drive and a backup of everything on a server Cassian had in a location not connected to this property. She thought about the warrants already issued, the names already being served, the machine already in the process of being stopped. Victor could take this house, and it would not matter. The evidence was already gone. She needed Cassian to know that, needed him to understand that what was happening inside this building was not a battle for the drive anymore. The drive was irrelevant. The battle now was she worked through it. The battle now was purely physical. Victor coming here with 15 men was no longer a strategic move. It was a rage move. An old man's furious last act against the person who had, over the course of one night, dismantled everything he'd spent 40 years building. He wasn't coming for the drive. He was coming for Cassian. Stood up. Alara, her father's voice. Sharp. The drive is already gone, she said. Victor knows that by now, which means he's not coming for the drive, which means Cassian doesn't know the situation has changed. She looked at the door. He's fighting like he still needs to protect the evidence. You are not opening that door, Dad. You are absolutely not opening that door. She looked at him, at the fear in his face and the fury underneath it, and the specific parental desperation of someone who has already lost too much and cannot recalculate losing more. The communications panel, she said. There was one bolted to the wall, a two-way connected to the main security system. She crossed to it and hit the transmit button. Cassian, if you can hear this, the evidence is transmitted. The drive is with the federal contact. You are not protecting the drive anymore. She released the button. Static. Victor knows. He's not here for evidence. He's here for you personally. Change your position. You copy. Static. Then Doyle's voice. Fractured. Short. Copy. Relaying. Then nothing for a long time. Then the sounds in the house changed. Percussion of it shifted from the distributed, multi-point sound of a broad defense to something more concentrated, more deliberate. The sound of a battle collapsing toward a single point. The main hall. She could feel it through the wall. The whole fight compressing, the physics of it changing. 15 men on one side, and Cassian's people on the other, and somewhere in the middle of it, moving through it with the patience of a man who had been preparing this specific moment for 4 years. Victor Rourke. Panel crackled. Cassian's voice. Strained. She could hear something in the background that was not gunfire. It had stopped, she realized. The gunfire had stopped. Alara. His voice was different. Controlled but different. In the way of something under tremendous pressure, holding its shape by sheer force of structure. Victor is in the main hall. His men have stood down. A pause. He wants to talk. She pressed the button. Talk to him. He wants to talk to you. The room felt very small. What? Not a question. The word just came out. He says he has something to tell you. About your mother, he says. A breath, rough at the edges. He says you've earned the right to hear it in person. She stared at the panel. Her father was on his feet. No, he said. No, absolutely. What does he know about Mom, she said. To no one. To the wall. Alara. Her father's voice dropped to something she'd never heard from him before. A register she didn't have a name for. There are things about your mother and Victor that I chose not to tell you, because she asked me not to. She turned and looked at him. His face was the face of a man about to put down something he'd carried too long. She didn't just work for him, her father said. In the beginning, Before I met her, she and Victor." He stopped. They were close. In a way that he pressed his hands against his face. "She left him. She built a life. She found me. She had you. She became someone completely different, and she was happy. She was—" His voice broke on the last word and recovered. "But she knew things that were personal, not just professional. And when she took those files, she was taking things that Victor would have considered his," Alara said. "Yes." She stood in the safe room at 7:43 in the morning, after the longest night of her life, and understood that her mother's story was larger than she'd been given, and that the last piece of it was in the main hall of this house, in the person of a man who should be dead. She pressed the panel button. "I'm coming out," she said. Alara Cassian's voice. "I'm coming out. Don't argue." She released the button, looked at her father. "Stay here." "I am not, Dad." She looked at him with something she hoped was steady enough to be convincing. "The evidence is already with the federal contact. The warrants are issued. Victor has nothing left to bargain with and nothing left to threaten with except what he knows. And whatever he knows about Mom," she swallowed. "I need to hear it, not because he has power over it, because she does." Her father looked at her for a long time. "She really is in you," he said finally. "Quiet. Not fighting anymore." She opened the safe room door and walked out into the corridor and moved toward the main hall. The house was very still, the kind of still that happens after noise, when the air is still processing what it's been through. She passed two of Cassian's men in the corridor. They looked at her, didn't stop her, which meant Cassian had said something. Came through the arch into the main hall. Victor Rourke was not what she'd built in her head either. He was 72 years old, heavy through the chest, white-haired. His face had the particular texture of a man who had spent decades getting exactly what he wanted, and had developed over that time a profound certainty that the world was arranged for his benefit. He looked at her the way you look at something that is both expected and surprising, like he'd known she'd, and was still mildly impressed that she had. 4 of his men were against the far wall, disarmed. Cassian stood 15 feet away, a gun in his hand, his weight distributed in a way that said he was ready to move in any direction. There was blood on his sleeve, not the shoulder. New blood, his forearm, and he was managing his expression very carefully. Victor smiled when he saw Alara. "You look like her," he said. Stopped walking. Stayed far enough away to be out of reach. "Say what you came to say," she said. "I came to say several things." His voice was cultured and calm and deeply wrong, in the way of something that has learned to wear calm as camouflage. "The most important is this. Your mother made a choice 14 years ago. She chose documentation over silence, and she chose you as the vessel for it, and she chose to die with that choice intact." He looked at her without apology. "I want you to understand that I don't resent her for it. I respected Clara enormously. She was the only person who ever truly outmaneuvered me." He paused. "I wanted you to know that. From me directly." Alara looked at him. "That it? Not quite." Something moved in his face. "The things she took from my archive, the personal material, not the operational files, the letters, the photographs, she kept those separate. I assumed they were in the box. There was nothing personal in the box." Victor studied her. "She would have protected you from that." "Yes." A pause that had something almost wistful in it, the closest this man probably came to grief. "She was always protecting you." "She was protecting everyone," Alara said. "From you." He absorbed that without flinching. "Yes," he said simply. "She was." The hall was very quiet. Victor looked at Cassian. "I built what I built," he said, "because my father built it first and I inherited it the same way you did. I am not asking for sympathy. I am telling you that the machinery outlasts the person who runs it, and when you dismantle mine, you will find parts of it in places you have not yet thought to look." "I'll find them," Cassian said. "I know you will." Victor looked at him with something she couldn't interpret. You were always better than I trained you to be. That was my miscalculation. He looked down at his hands. I should like to sit down now. I believe I am quite finished. Cassian looked at Alara. She held his gaze across the hall, across the aftermath of a night that had begun with candlelight and a debt and a bullet, and something moved between them that had no name yet, but was large enough to require naming eventually. Outside at the north gate, the first federal vehicle appeared through the trees. Federal vehicles came through the north gate at 7:51 in the morning, and Victor Rourke watched them from the window of the main hall, with the expression of a man watching weather he'd predicted, but had somehow still hoped wouldn't arrive. He didn't run. Alara noticed that. She'd expected him to expected the animal calculation of a cornered man, the last desperate geometry of someone who had spent 40 years escaping consequence. But he stood at the window with his hands behind his back and watched the black vehicles park in the gravel and said nothing. Cassian said nothing either. The two of them occupied the same room with the particular silence of men who have a history too complicated for the moment to contain. And Alara stood between them and felt the weight of everything that had been built and broken and buried in the space between those two people press against the air. 3 agents came through the front door, led by a woman in her mid-40s, dark coat, the kind of face that had learned to give nothing away in rooms exactly like this one. She looked at Cassian first, then at Victor, then at Alara. Alara Voss, she said. Yes, Deputy U.S. Attorney Claire Mercer. She held up credentials. I spoke with Renata Rourke approximately 2 hours ago. Mercer. Alara registered the name, looked at the woman, saw nothing obvious in her face that connected to the name at the top of the list in her mother's files. The name Gerald Mercer, federal judge, foundation builder, the original architect of everything that had collapsed this morning. The name was the name. Mercer, Alara said carefully. The woman met her eyes. Gerald Mercer was my grandfather, she said, flat, preemptive. The tone of someone who had decided long ago that the information was better volunteered than discovered. I became aware of his connection to this network 4 years ago. It is the reason I have been building this case. She paused. I want you to know that before we go any further. The room absorbed that. Victor laughed. It was not a warm sound. His own granddaughter, he said, to no one specifically. Gerald would have found that exquisite. Gerald is dead, Claire Mercer said, and his network is being dismantled this morning. 11 warrants have been executed in the past hour. 3 individuals are in custody. She looked at Victor with an expression that was not triumph. It was older and colder than triumph. Victor Rourke, you are under arrest. Victor turned from the window. He looked at Claire Mercer, then at Cassian, then at Alara. His gaze on Alara lasted the longest. She would have been proud of you, he said, meaning Clara, meaning her mother. Alara said nothing. The agents moved. The processing took 4 hours. Statements, documentation, chain of custody for the drive, the formal transfer of everything that had been transmitted to the federal server, careful legal architecture of something that had to be built correctly, or it would be challenged and until it collapsed. Claire Mercer moved through it with a precision that suggested she had rehearsed this morning in her head many times. Alara sat in the kitchen with her father and drank coffee that was finally hot enough to be worth drinking. Her father had aged in the night. Or maybe she was seeing him differently, the same face, but with the particular texture of someone whose maintained story has finally been set down. He looked lighter in one sense, and in another sense completely exhausted, the way you feel when you've been clenching a muscle for so long that releasing it is almost painful. You should have told me about Mom, she said, not angry, just true. I know. He wrapped both hands around his cup. She made me promise. She said the less you knew, the safer you'd be. And when she died, He stopped. I kept the promise because breaking it felt like losing her again. Alara looked at her coffee. What was she like? When she worked for him? Young, he said, and very capable, and completely wrong about what she'd gotten herself into until she wasn't. He was quiet for a moment. She left when she found out what the files were actually being used for. She'd thought she was managing historical records, private archive work. She was good at it, and it paid well, and he shook his head when she understood the leverage component, what the operational files were for. She couldn't stay, but she didn't destroy it when she left. She copied it. She thought someday. Someone. She kept saying that. Someday someone will need this to be real. He looked at his hands. She was right. She just couldn't know it would be you. Elarath sat with that. Her mother at 30-something, making a calculation about the future, trusting the future, packing evidence into a box and labeling it family things and giving it to her daughter with the particular faith of someone who believes that truth, properly stored, outlasts the people who try to bury it. The archivist's last act of faith. The personal material, Alara said. Victor said she took personal things too, letters, photographs. He said she kept them separate. Her father nodded slowly. Where he reached into his jacket, she hadn't seen him do it, hadn't noticed the jacket had an interior pocket, hadn't noticed him carrying anything. He set a folded envelope on the table. She looked at it. She gave it to me the week before she died, he said. She said, if Alara ever needs to understand, give her this. I've been carrying it for 14 years because I could never, his voice stopped, started again. I could never determine what needs to understand meant. Last night seemed like it qualified. Alara picked up the envelope, her mother's handwriting on the front. One word, E. She opened it. A single page, handwritten, dated 3 weeks before Clara Voss died. She read it slowly. She read it twice. It was not an explanation of the files. It was not a political statement or a confession or a legal document. It was a letter from her mother to her, written in the particular voice of someone who has accepted what is coming and wants to say the things that might not get said otherwise. It talked about the summer they'd spent at a lake when Alara was 8, and the way her daughter had methodically built-in sand structure for 3 days, and then watched the water take it without crying. You understood then, without knowing you understood, that some things are worth building even when you know they won't last. It talked about the box. Obliquely, what I've left in your keeping. You'll know when the time comes. I trust you with it the way I trust you with everything. And it ended with something Alara had to read 3 times before she could hold it steady. I loved your father for teaching me that an ordinary life is not a lesser life. I loved you for proving it. Whatever comes after me, make sure it's yours. Not inherited. Not owed yours. She folded the page, placed it back in the envelope, held it in both hands for a moment. Her father was watching her with the careful attention of someone who has been waiting 14 years to know if he did the right thing. Thank you, she said, for keeping it. He let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. Cassian found her in the east corridor at noon. He looked like he'd been through a building that had partially fallen, which was, she supposed, not far from literal. His jacket was gone. The bandaging on his shoulder had been redone by someone who knew what they were doing, and someone had also wrapped his forearm properly. And he had the deliberate, careful movement of a person managing 3 separate points of pain and acknowledging none of them. Stopped a few feet from her. Your father, he said. Sleeping. Finally, she leaned against the wall. Renata? At the federal building. She'll be there most of the day. He looked at the corridor, at the east wing, at the door of the locked room which someone had closed again. Claire Mercer's team found 2 more properties this morning. Victor's operational bases for the past 4 years. A pause. One of them is offshore. It'll take longer, but they'll get it. Yes. He looked at her. The 11 names. 7 are in custody. 3 have surrendered voluntarily, which Mercer says is actually useful. It means they're talking. He paused. The 11th is a sitting district court judge who had a cardiac event this morning when his home was searched. He's in surgery. She absorbed that, the machine eating itself as she'd thought last night, the names on her mother's list, finally meeting the consequence that 40 years of careful architecture had kept at bay. It's going to take time, she said. All of it. Years, probably. The legal process, I know. She looked at him. But it's started. Yes, he said it simply. It's started. They stood in the corridor and the house was quiet around them, not the watchful, armed quiet of the night before, but something genuinely emptier. The guards were still there, but they had the quality of men standing down from something rather than bracing for it. The debt, Alara said. My father's. Cassian looked at her steadily. There is no debt. Legally, the contracts were fraudulent. Every instrument was generated through coercion or forgery. Your father's legal team, he stopped. I'll make sure he has one. A good one. The process of formally clearing his record will take time, but the underlying case is... He paused. Renata's word was airtight. She nodded, looked at the floor for a moment. The marble, the same marble she'd walked across in a dress someone else had chosen, following a script she hadn't been given. The marriage, she said. Legally. Something shifted in his face. Very slight. It was formalized before the ceremony was interrupted, he said carefully. The officiant completed the registration. As far as the state is concerned, a pause. We're married. She looked at him. You could annul it, he said. The circumstances, I know. The grounds are clear. Duress, fraudulent inducement. I know, Cassian. Stop talking. She pushed off and stood straight and looked at him, this man, who had been introduced to her as a monster and had turned out to be something so much more complicated than that, so much more broken and stubborn and human than the legend that preceded him. A man who kept a dead man's office untouched for 4 years because he needed to understand what he'd inherited. Carried the key to a locked room in his jacket pocket instead of somewhere sealed away. Who had taken a bullet meant for her and kept moving and said it was not serious. Who had asked her, in the middle of a crisis, what she wanted to do. Not told her. Asked her. My mother said, Alara began. Stopped. Started again. She said, make sure whatever comes next is yours. Not inherited, not owed. Yes, his voice was very careful. I'm not staying because of a debt, she said. There's no debt anymore. I know. And I'm not staying because of a piece of paper that was signed in the middle of a firefight. I know. She looked at him. At the exhaustion that was finally showing through the control, the way it always showed when people were too tired to maintain the performance. She looked at the man inside the legend, the flawed and stubborn and complicated man, who had spent 4 years trying to do right by something he'd inherited wrong. I need time, she said, to understand what normal looks like. For me, for my father. For she gestured at the air, meaning everything, the whole impossible shape of the last 48 hours. For all of this to become something I can actually walk around in. That's reasonable, he said. I'm not walking away. Something in his face changed. The restraint around it loosened by maybe 10%, which on him was the equivalent of a full expression. I'm also not making any decisions while I'm this exhausted, she said. And you have a shoulder wound that you've been pretending doesn't exist since approximately 9 o'clock last night, and someone needs to make you actually sit down. I'm fine, Cassian. He stopped, looked at her with the expression she'd seen for the first time at the altar, and could now finally name. It was not calculation. It had never been calculation. It was the look of someone who expected things to go badly and was perpetually bracing for it. And when they didn't go badly, he had no protocol for that and had to pause and recalibrate. I don't do well with people making decisions about my... I know. She moved toward him. stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly. Sit down anyway. He sat down. Right there in the corridor against the wall, the way someone sits when their body has been waiting for permission for hours. She sat beside him. They sat in the east corridor in the particular silence of two people who have been through something together that neither of them has words for yet. And the light came through the window at the end of the hall in the flat, clear way that late morning light does after a long night, and neither of them said anything for a while. The formal legal process began that afternoon. Claire Mercer's team worked with the efficiency of people who had been ready for exactly this for a long time. Victor was processed, charged, held without bail, on grounds that the presiding judge, one of the three who had not appeared on her grandfather's list, which Mercer had clearly identified in advance, characterized as straightforward. The network of protected officials who had made Victor's ghost existence possible were systematically separated from their protections, suspended pending investigation, recused from relevant cases, in 3 instances arrested directly. The judge who'd had the cardiac event survived his surgery. He was charged from his hospital bed. Renata spent 16 hours at the federal building, across 3 consecutive days. She emerged from each session looking more tired, and also, somehow, more settled the particular way people look when they are finally telling the truth about something they've been carrying. She and Alara had a conversation on the second evening that was not easy and not warm, and was also, in its own way, necessary. "I thought you were a plant," Renata said. They were in the kitchen, the only room in the house that felt genuinely neutral. "When you arrived, I thought Victor had sent you, that the whole debt scenario was a set-up text at someone inside Cassian's operation." "I know," Alara said. "The questions I asked you that first morning, they weren't just information gathering. I know that too." Renata looked at her with the directness that was Alara had come to understand, simply how she moved through the world, no softening, no diplomatic approach, just the fact of her opinion, presented clearly and accepted or not. "You handled it better than I would have, in your position. You were protecting him," Alara said. "I get it. I'm always protecting him." Something shifted in Renata's face, something old and tired. "I have been protecting him since he was 23 years old, and Victor started using him to run the shipping routes, and I could see exactly what was happening and couldn't stop it." She picked up her coffee cup, set it back down. "I couldn't stop Victor from shaping him, but I could make sure certain parts of him stayed." She paused. "Stayed worth something." Alara thought about the man in the corridor, sitting against the wall because she'd told him to. 10% expression. "They did," she said. Renata looked at her with an assessment that was also somewhere underneath relief. Martin Voss's legal process moved faster than expected. The fraudulent debt instruments were invalidated within the first week. The paper trail from her mother's files made the forgery case so clear that the relevant financial institution's legal team, apparently eager to establish distance from any connection to Victor's network, cooperated fully and quickly. The formal criminal record from 11 years ago, the embezzlement charge that had destroyed her father's professional standing, was identified as fabricated, ported by documentation that had sat in Victor's private archive until Clara Voss took it, cried when the lawyer called. He was sitting in the kitchen of the estate, where he'd spent most of the first week. He and Marin had developed a functional, careful rapport built primarily around the kitchen table and strong coffee, and when the call came, he held the phone for a moment after it ended, and his shoulders shook, and he made no sound. Alara sat across from him and didn't say anything, just sat there. Eventually he looked up. His eyes were red, and his face was the most open she'd ever seen it, stripped of the protective distance that she understood now he'd been wearing for over a decade. The face of a man who has just put down something he didn't know how to live without, and is discovering that he can stand up straight. "I need to rebuild," he said. Everything. Start again. Yes, she said. I don't know where to. You start with one thing, she said. Whatever the first thing is. You start there. He looked at her, the way he'd looked at her in the safe room. She really is in you. Your mother would have been. He stopped, smiled, which was unexpected and which changed his whole face. Actually, your mother would have said finally, and gone back to whatever she was doing. Elara laughed. She didn't expect it. It came up from somewhere genuine, and she let it. Yes, she said. She absolutely would have. 3 weeks passed. Cassian dismantled the operational structure of the organization, systematically, not quickly, because quick dismantling created gaps that dangerous things could move through, but thoroughly, with the methodical attention of someone who had been planning this for years and was now finally doing it, without one hand tied behind his back. The shipping company, which was legitimate and large, and employed 400 people who had nothing to do with anything illegal, remained. The investment portfolio, under Renata's management, remained. The rest. The infrastructure of leverage, the network of compromised officials, the extralegal arrangements that Victor had built and Cassian had maintained while trying to understand their scope, came apart piece by piece. Some of it was ugly. Some of the people who'd been inside that structure didn't leave easily, and there were nights in that 3-week period when Elara lay in her room, she'd moved to a different room, one that faced the garden rather than the drive, on her own initiative, and with no comment from Cassian, and heard things she couldn't identify from some saints, and made herself stay where she was, rather than investigate. She and Cassian talked every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 10 minutes in the kitchen before one of them had somewhere to be. Conversations were not romantic and not strategic. They were simply the ongoing, accumulative exchange of two people who were learning the shape of each other without the emergency to structure it. She learned that he slept 4 hours on good nights, that he'd taught himself to cook in his 30s because it was the one activity that required enough attention to quiet his mind, that the locked room, now open, now gradually being emptied and reorganized, had been closed, not only because of the files, but because of the photograph. Victor's smile that reached his eyes and meant nothing. He hadn't been ready to look at it every day. He learned that she was better with numbers than she let on insurance work, had given her a fluency with risk and probability that she'd never considered translating anywhere else. That she called her father every morning, first thing, before coffee. That she was working through her mother's letter, slowly, in pieces, the way you work through something that's to be absorbed rather than read. He learned that she'd left a cat with a neighbor. "You should go get your cat," he said one morning. She looked at him across the kitchen table. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know. But your cat is presumably having a normal life with someone else's furniture, and you should go be there for a day and then come back." He looked at his coffee cup. "The option exists. I want you to know the option exists." She understood what he was really saying. You are not here because you have nowhere else to go. You are here because you choose to be, and that choice is available to you every day, not just once. "I'll go Thursday," she said. "I'll be back Friday." He nodded, said nothing else. But the 10% expression was there. The final piece arrived 6 weeks after the night of the wedding. A letter, through formal legal channels, from Claire Mercer's office, addressed to Elara specifically. She opened it at the kitchen table, with her father beside her, and Cassian Tan standing at the counter with his coffee. It was a formal notification that the materials contained on the drive, recovered from a storage unit, materials originally compiled by Clara Voss, employed as archivist, over 11 years of service, had been entered as primary evidence in the federal proceeding against Victor Rourke and 14 co-defendants. The letter used language that was careful and legal and completely bloodless, as legal language was. But in the last paragraph, Claire Mercer had written something that fell slightly outside the formal register. The evidence your mother preserved represents one of the most complete documentation of organized criminal infiltration of public institutions that this office has encountered. It is frankly extraordinary archival work. I thought you should know that. I thought she should be on record for it somewhere. Alara folded the letter. Her father reached over and put his hand on top of hers. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked out the kitchen window at the grounds, at the tree line, at the October light that was doing something particular and low across the grass. She wanted it to matter, she said finally. That's all she wanted. It mattered, her father said. She nodded. Let the moment be what it was. Cassian burned the marriage contract on the last day of October. He did it without ceremony in the fireplace in the main room, which was not the dramatic gesture the setting might imply, but simply the place where things got burned because it had a proper flue. He laid the document on the grate and touched match to the corner, and they both watched it go. Paper caught slowly. The edges went first, curling and darkening, and then the center, and then there was nothing left but ash and a small orange aftermath that faded. Now what? Alara said. Now whatever you want, he said. There's no contract. There's still a legal record. I'm aware, he looked at her. I meant as a framework. For what this is, there's no contract anymore. A pause, which means, whatever this is, it's because you're choosing it. She looked at him, at the fireplace, at the ash. I'm choosing it, she said. He didn't move dramatically or say anything grand. He was not a man built for grand gestures, and she was not a woman who trusted them. He simply nodded, and the nod carried more weight than most speeches she'd heard. There will be hard parts, he said. The legal process will take years. He paused. Renata is dealing with things about her family that are going to take longer than years. My organization is in the middle of a structural change that some people inside it resent deeply. There will be Cassian incidents. Probably. Things I won't be able to predict. Cassian. She waited until he stopped. I know, he looked at her. I am 26 years old, she said, and I spent one night in a burning building and found my mother inside a hard drive and learned that the world I thought I was living in had a completely different architecture underneath it, and I am still here. She held his eyes. I know what hard looks like. We can manage hard. He was quiet for a moment. We, he said. Yes, she let the word be simple. We. 3 months later, in February, she brought her cat home. The estate had acquired, in those months, the texture of a place that was lived in rather than fortified, not because the security had softened. Cassian was not a man who softened security, but because the quality of being inside it had changed. Her father visited twice a month. Renata came for dinners that were occasionally contentious and always honest. Marin had stopped looking at Alara with the careful assessment of someone taking measure of an unknown quantity and started looking at her. The way she looked at the furniture, something that had found its place and would remain. The cat was a gray tabby named Felix who expressed his opinion of his new environment by ignoring everything for 3 days, and then choosing, with great deliberation, to sit on Cassian's chair. Cassian looked at the cat on his chair. The cat looked at Cassian. Cassian moved to a different chair. Alara, watching from the doorway, did not laugh. She pressed her lips together very firmly and did not laugh. He likes you, she said. He's sitting on my chair. That's how he shows affection. Cassian looked at the cat with an expression she'd never seen from him before, completely out of his depth, slightly offended, and working very hard to appear neither. Can't just, he absolutely can, she said. He's a cat. Cat began to purr. Cassian looked at Alara. She looked back at him, with the full weight of the past 4 months in it, the night in the storage unit, the corridor, the burning room, the ash in the fireplace, the letter from Claire Mercer, her father's hands shaking around a coffee cup, her mother's handwriting on the bottom of a box. All of it, present in the room, present in both of them. Fine, Cassian said. To the cat. To her. To whatever had been assembled from the rubble of everything that had tried to prevent this particular Tuesday morning in February. He opened the book on the side table. Felix purred. Alara went to make coffee, and the light came through the east window, the way it always did at this hour, flat and clear and indifferent to everything it touched. And the house was simply a house. And the morning was simply a morning. And the death that had started everything was gone, so completely that the only evidence it had ever existed was the two people it had forced together. And the choice they had each, separately and then together, made everyday sense. Not inherited, not owed theirs.